For the crowd who thought the Zags were just one big man away from being national title contenders, folks, I got some really good news for you.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Wednesday. Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Folks, we got an update here. The Zags are closing in on adding a European big man who would be the 13th and final scholarship player for Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs. We're going to talk about Gonzaga's strategy this offseason. We're going to, of course, talk specifically about the player, where their fit is, what it might look like next year and beyond. We're going to close out the show with some Olympic updates as well, an update on Andrew Nembhard, an update on Gonzaga 2025 target Nick Kaminia as well. But we start the show. I'm going to timestamp the time of recording. It is 4:20 p.m. exactly Pacific time on Tuesday, May 28th. The reason I am doing that is because we are waiting for an official confirmation. But right now, Gonzaga is heavily in pursuit of Real Madrid center Ismaila Diagne. Diagne is a Senegalese big man. He's 17 years old. And there was reports from multiple Spanish news outlets, where he plays again in Real Madrid, that he had committed to Gonzaga. However, Theo Lawson at the Spokesman Review indicated that he has not been able to confirm that Diagne is committed to Gonzaga. He spoke to a source within the university who indicated that they are kind of cruising down towards the finish line, I believe is the way that it was phrased, but that source specifically said it is not done yet. So by the time you're listening to this, it's possible that has changed. Hopefully, it has changed in a way where this is done, and the show you're listening to, where I'm going to talk about this player, Diagne, as if he is going to come to Gonzaga, is in fact a show about him committing to Gonzaga. Obviously, it's possible that things break down. He doesn't end up in Spokane, in which case back to the drawing board. At least we know that Gonzaga is clearly in pursuit of potentially filling that 13th and final scholarship spot, something that I would have told you, and in fact did tell you on the show, that I did not think Gonzaga was going to do. I thought they would stop at 11, just like they did last year. I didn't expect to fill all 13 scholarships, but if this gets done, Diagne will be the 13th player on scholarship for the Gonzaga Bulldogs. They also have 4 walk-ons. It would be a very full roster in Spokane for Mark Few's team in the 2024-25 season. Let's talk about who Ismaila Diagne is. Diagne is a 7-foot, 17-year-old center from Senegal. So he's an African center. He has been playing for Real Madrid, part of their youth academy, since 2020. So since he was 14 years old, he has been a fixture in the youth leagues for this Real Madrid, a very, very prominent EuroLeague basketball program over in Spain. He most recently played for their U18 team in the Adidas Next Gen tournament. In that tournament, he started 6 of the 8 games for Real Madrid. He averaged 10.2 points, 7.8 rebounds, just under a block per game, and shot a hair over 55% from the field. In the title game, he had 10 points and 7 rebounds with 3 assists. His team secured a victory over a team from France headlined by Nolan Traore, who is a Gonzaga target in the 2024 recruiting class and a player who is more than likely going to stay overseas, as he's currently being projected as a potential top 5 pick in the 2025 NBA draft. Diagne's team beat them, and he had 10-7 in that game. He also played for Real Madrid in the ACB League for the regular season as a very young player. The stats here that I'm going to read are not going to pop off the page. He averaged 5 points, 4.5 boards, and 1 block as a 17-year-old playing against professional basketball players in a very good league in the ACB. This is a very tantalizing, high upside, young, raw, but very, very good prospect that Mark Few and Gonzaga, once again, are tapping into that extensive history of European development. This is Gonzaga's bread and butter. Going out and getting European big men to come to Spokane, Washington, and develop into stars. It is something. I said European, but sometimes they're Canadian, sometimes they're Japanese. It doesn't matter. Gonzaga can get international players to come to this program. They do it with guards as well, but they're really good with the bigs. And this is another potential opportunity for Gonzaga to bring somebody into the program who can develop into an NBA caliber talent. We've already seen him on future mock drafts for the places that look at mocks in 25 and 26 and 27 and beyond. He's already a player that has cropped up in those conversations. So it's not like he's a complete unknown. Diagne is already a player who is a potential NBA prospect. When you're 17 years old and you're contributing for Real Madrid, when you've been in their system for 3 or 4 years, when you played very well in a U18 tournament sponsored by Adidas, of course, you're going to start to get that attention. They got Mark Few's attention. They got Gonzaga's attention. They went out and, as again, for recording this, have not finalized it yet, but they went out and made him an offer, and it sounds like there is mutual interest on both sides, and this thing could potentially come together. Like I said, this would be Gonzaga's 13th and final scholarship spot. The team had 11 scholarships filled last year. They lost Anton Watson to graduation. They lost Luka Krajinovic and Pavle Stosic to the transfer portal. That brought them from 11 down to 8. They have now filled, again, if this happens, they have filled all 5 scholarship spots. They add Michael Ajayi. They add Caleb Battle, Emmanuel Innocenti. That's 3. Braeden Smith is 4. And Diagne would be 5. 5 plus 8. Boom. That is all 13 scholarships. And I want to talk about that for a second. We're going to get into a little bit more about what Diagne's role might look like next year if he's on campus, what the future means for Gonzaga with him potentially in the mix. We're going to get to that. But in an era where we're starting to see teams choose to not fill all of their scholarships, John Calipari went public at Arkansas and said, I may only add 8 or 9 guys. If John Calipari truly only has 9 scholarship players next year, to the point where you, in order to even do a 5-on-5 scrimmage, you have to use a walk-on, I'm not sure if Cal's actually going to do that. As I'm recording this right now, he currently has 8 players on the roster, so maybe that will be the situation. But we're starting to see that more. And Gonzaga, of course, only filled 11 spots last year. A lot of high-profile teams are filling 10 or 11 spots, and it's understandable. You don't think you can use those final roster spots on a player who's not going to just enter the portal next year. I believe Calipari's direct quote was something like, I'm just developing guys for other teams, which I don't think is the correct way to look at it. In fact, for Calipari, who spent 15 years at Kentucky developing players for NBA teams, I don't really see how it's different. Of, oh, well, this guy's going to transfer somewhere else. I think that that's an outdated way to think about it. And one of the things that has been one of my favorite things about following Gonzaga basketball for as long as I have is the ability of Mark Few and their staff to consistently be on the cutting edge of how to construct a roster, how to develop talent, how to acquire talent. The reason that Gonzaga has been to as many consecutive NCAA tournaments as they have, the reason they've been to 9 straight Sweet 16s, the reason they've made every NCAA tournament since the turn of the century, the reason that has happened is not the conference, it's not luck, it's not purely Mark Few. What it is this team's ability to find ways to add talent to the roster, to retain talent on the roster, to develop talent, and they do it by being different. They don't just follow everybody else. If they just tried to do the same thing that high major teams do, they would have failed because they don't have the resources of high major teams. It wouldn't have worked. But because they have constantly found ways to adjust, they utilize transfers well before anybody else utilized transfers. Dan Dickau was a massive transfer addition. That was 20 plus years ago. They utilized the international market way before other teams did. Rony Turioff is a great example of that. They utilized the sit-out transfer, or the sit-out year, the redshirt year, the Kelly Olynyk situation. They utilized that well before anybody else did. Then they started using the portal to get guys to come to campus and sit out for a year and develop behind the scenes. The Kyle Wiltshire, the Brandon Clark, the Jonathan Williams, the Nigel Williams-Goss. Then they started getting into high-profile recruiting because they finally got the ability to do that. But they didn't go nuts, only recruiting 5-star talent. They supplemented. Some of the best players Gonzaga has acquired since they've become like a national brand were seldomly known international players like Rui Hachimura, who was not a known quantity before he came to campus. Corey Kispert was outside the top 100 of his recruiting class. Gonzaga has consistently found ways to, for lack of a better term, and to be a little bit tongue-in-cheek, they zag. Everybody else zigs, they zag. They do things differently. They always have. They've utilized the transfer portal before it was even called the transfer portal. They utilized grad transfers to be able to add talent that had veteran experience immediately to their roster. Other teams were not doing that. When Gonzaga added Byron Wesley, when Gonzaga added Jordan Matthews, when Gonzaga added Gino Crandall, other teams were not doing this. Gonzaga has consistently found ways to be ahead of the curve in terms of the adjustments and the changes that are happening in college basketball. This offseason, Gonzaga has proven definitively definitively that they can hang with everybody else, if not at a higher level. Their ability to recruit this offseason has been unbelievable. And yes, they're not utilizing high school recruiting as much as I know some people would like them to do, but they have found other ways. Getting Braeden Smith to commit to Gonzaga and be willing to redshirt for a year is unprecedented in the transfer portal era. Getting a player like Emmanuel Innocenti, who started 33 games last year for Tarleton State, who played 33 minutes a game, to come to Gonzaga knowing that there's not a big role for him, unbelievable that is happening. When schools like Grand Canyon and St. Mary's and others were in the mix for him, and they were going to play him right away. Braeden Smith would have started at Cal or Syracuse or some of the other places that were potentially recruiting him. Now they go after a kid here in Diagne who is being pursued by other programs. There is interest in him mutually from other programs. He is a high upside kid. And they're going out and they're saying, we don't care that our teams are only filling 10 or 11 and they're calling it a quit. They're calling it an off season and they're done. They're just going to roll with what they got. Last year, Gonzaga tried it. They tried the 11 scholarship players and it went bad immediately. Two things went bad for Gonzaga last year: their lack of depth and the fact that their team hadn't really gelled because they had so many newcomers who all hadn't been in the system. Mark Few said, those were my two problems last year. I'm going to fix them going forward. So he's going to add all 13 scholarships. Even if Diagne doesn't ultimately commit, it's pretty clear Gonzaga wants to fill that last spot. So they're going to utilize all 13 of those scholarships. And they're going to make sure that they have pieces in place so that they don't have an offseason where their 3 or 4 starters are all new, they haven't played together, and they have these growing pains like Gonzaga had last year when they struggled against Washington or San Diego State or UConn or Purdue or whoever it was. Santa Clara obviously was the worst loss of the year. Like Gonzaga Murphy didn't want to deal with that. So he said, I'm going to get my point guard of the future to already have a year of experience in this system under his belt. I'm going to get a combo guard in the future, Emmanuel Innocenti. He's going to have a year of experience under his belt, so he's going to be ready to step into a role next year. Whether that's a starting role, whether that's a backup role, kind of depends on the Isaiah Harwell recruitment, Jalen Harrelson, other pieces potentially in that conversation. But they have that guy ready to roll. Diagne is a player that they're identifying primarily for what he's going to bring for this program in the future. We're going to talk about that in a second. But Gonzaga is looking ahead. We want depth at every position in case we have injuries like they did with Luka Krajinovic last year, in case we have and Steel Venters, probably a better example for last year, but 2 guys who were injured for big chunks of the year caused them a lot of problems. Mark Few says none of that. We're going to fill all the scholarship spots. We're going to have depth at every single position, and those spots are going to be utilized for players who can fill in the future. Innocenti is here for multiple years. Braeden Smith's here for multiple years. Diagne, if he commits, probably here for multiple years. Gonzaga is going out and getting guys who can fill roles this year, even if it's just a practice squad role like it is for Braeden Smith, but who are also going to be here for the future so that they don't have to worry about rebuilding the roster every year and going into a season where a bunch of guys have not played basketball together. And the fact that Gonzaga has found a way to do that is coaches, great coaches, Hall of Fame coaches, cannot figure out how to do this. Mark Few and the Zags can. For people who think they don't have the budget, they don't have the NIL resources, they can't hang, they have continually for 25 years found ways to make their situation work in an advantageous way for them. There is no reason to not believe that they can continue to do so. And this recruitment, even if it doesn't happen, but this recruitment right now, the Braeden Smith edition, Emmanuel Innocenti, et cetera, is proof that this team knows how to build a roster, knows how to use the rules to their advantage, and knows how to continue to stay competitive. There's a reason they've been to 25 NCAA tournaments in a row. And it looks like that's going to continue as Mark Few continues to build a roster that is going to be great next season and is going to be great beyond that as well. But that's what I want to talk about now. What would Diagne bring to this year's team in 2024-25? What does that role look like for him? And is there room for him in the current rotation? And what does his future potentially look like in Spokane? Again, hypothetically, assuming he does make that commitment, we're going to talk about all that in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, FanDuel. Folks, it is playoff time in the NBA and the NHL. Baseball is in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now, new customers will get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 whether you win or lose. So bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. And folks, like I said in the intro there, if you're somebody who was waiting for another edition and now you're like, all right, if this is finalized, Zach's got a chance to win it all. Well, folks, at FanDuel, they're plus 1,800 to win the big dance in 2025. They started the offseason at plus 3,000. So if you want to maximize those winnings, What are you waiting for? You got to go to FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic W. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, segment 2, still in your patents, still Locked On Zags podcast. We're still talking about Ismaila Diagne, the potential new addition for Gonzaga, 17-year-old center from Senegal who's been playing the last couple of years in the youth academy for Real Madrid. And I want to talk more about what his role would look like at Gonzaga next year, pending a commitment. Because as I've been saying on the show, for those of you who are everyday listeners, first of all, shout out to you. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen. I appreciate it. One of the things we've kind of thought Gonzaga's roster was finalized for like a while now. We thought the Caliph Battle Edition kind of, okay, it's probably pretty much done. Maybe they add some smaller, guys who maybe aren't going to have big roles like Luka or Pavle were. And then they go out and they go get Emmanuel Innocenti. Then they go out and they go get Braeden Smith. And now they're going out and making another addition. But ultimately, it fundamentally hasn't changed the fact that Gonzaga's rotation for next season appears to be filled. And as a 17-year-old, who's not turning 18 until December, he will literally be 17 at the start of the college basketball season. My belief is that there is a very limited role for Diagne as a freshman this upcoming season. It's hard to imagine that he carves out a significant role, even though he is a player that is projected as a potential future draft pick. He's very young. It would be his first year in college basketball. Very few players adapt immediately to playing college basketball after coming over overseas. And Gonzaga's got a rich history of European players coming over. Very few of them were instantly great at Gonzaga. Domantas Sabonis was a rare exception, and he was a player who was born in the United States, whose father played in the United States. Like, he had a different kind of grasp on not college basketball necessarily. Obviously, his dad didn't play college ball, but maybe a different familiarity with the country than many of the other players. I mean, even the elite ones. Rui Hachimura was one of the most elite international players in Gonzaga basketball history. He was not. He didn't contribute at all as a freshman. He was very chaotic, played just sparingly, just wasn't really ready to be a contributor. Killian Tilly played a little bit, but he got much better. Joel Ayayi redshirted. Like, the list goes on and on. Rony Turioff wasn't a big contributor right away. Filip Petrusev wasn't a big contributor right away, although he was more so than many of the other players that have come in. Like, Shemek Karnowski was like the fourth big for Gonzaga as a freshman. Like, it's pretty rare for players to be contributors right away coming overseas. And while Diagne is a player who has a lot of pedigree, who has a lot of kind of hype around him, he's joining a team where he's pretty clearly going to be the fourth big. Diagne is not going to cut into Braden Huff's minutes. He's not going to cut into Ben Gregg's minutes. He's not going to cut into Graham Ike's minutes. He is the fourth big. Gonzaga historically rarely plays their fourth big. In the Drew Timme era, especially when Chet Holmgren was in the mix, they didn't play a fourth big like at all. The year that Efton Reed was here, and then Ben Gregg kind of cut into Efton Reed's playing time, once that happened and Efton Reed became the fourth big, he played like 3 minutes a game for the rest of the season, and then he transferred. They don't play fourth bigs. Coming before this, again, this theoretical commitment, the fourth big on Gonzaga's roster was going to be Michael Ajayi, some combination of Michael Ajayi and Jun-Suk Yeo. My guess was that Ike and Huff were your centers. They were going to combine play basically every minute at the 5. Ben Gregg was your starting 4. When Ben Gregg wasn't on the floor, Ajayi was sliding up to play the 4 with a 3-guard lineup with Battle, Hickman, and Nembhard. I still think that's generally going to be the situation. I think that Gonzaga has these 3 guards that are going to play a lot. Ajayi is going to play a lot, and he's going to have to play some at the 4. You're going to have to find minutes for Steele Venters and Dusty Stromer as well. I think all of that kind of results in a situation where Ajayi plays a lot of his minutes at the 4, and that creates a situation where there's just not a lot of minutes available for somebody like Diagne. That plus his age, just all of this kind of points to a situation where we're not really expecting a big role right away. But there are a couple of ways that he can be quality insurance. Mainly, as we're recording this again right now, timestamping it once again, we don't know the final situation for Michael Ajayi. That will be Thursday's show. We will cover that on Thursday, whether Ajayi stays in the NBA draft process. We'll talk about what it means. We'll talk about, what the new starting lineup will look like. If he returns to Gonzaga, pulls out of the draft process, we're going to talk about that as well. But this could be a move to help be kind of preventative. I don't want to spread any false rumors or anything. And again, by the time you're listening to this, it's possible we already have an answer to this. But it is possible that Gonzaga is starting to look for alternatives because they believe that Ajayi is going to stay in the draft process. It makes some sense that that is a potential outcome. The majority of pundits, the majority belief that Michael Ajayi will not stay in the draft process. He's not being mocked on mock drafts pretty much anywhere. It seems like it would be surprising if there was teams guaranteeing him a spot in the draft, because I think we'd be hearing about that. We'd be seeing him climbing up mock drafts. Jonathan Mobo, incidentally from San Francisco, started rocketing up mock drafts, consistently started showing up in the second round, and recently announced he's going to stay in the draft process. Probably because there was people telling him, hey, we're going to draft you in the second round. That information was getting out to scouts and analysts, and those people started rewriting their mock drafts, including him in the second round. That's kind of how this process works. If you're not seeing Michael Ajayi starting to pop up in the second round, he's probably not getting a whole lot of second round promises. Again, this might be all moot by the time you're listening to this, but we will have more conversation about Ajayi. I would say that there's a chance that this is a move, at least to just hedge your bet a little bit of like, hey, let's get us some extra depth. Let's get somebody who can fill that spot. He's also the biggest player on the roster if he commits, Diagne. He's 7 foot. Braeden Huff, Ben Gregg, Graham Ike, I think they're all listed at 6'10". Huff might be listed at 6'11". Regardless, Diagne would be the biggest player on the roster. He's young. He's a developmental big who could contribute in spots. He could be an emergency use for foul trouble situations, certain lineups with a bunch of bigs, cough, cough, Santa Clara. He could be utilized in those games to potentially kind of help minimize the size advantage that the other team has. So there's a lot of ways that he could be utilized. He is an NBA prospect, so I think he's great insurance for this upcoming season. He's also potential insurance if Graham Ike decides not to stay after this year. Graham Ike is going to be here next year. He has 2 years of eligibility. But he may not want to be in college for his 6th year. He may want this next year to be his final year. If that's the case, Braeden Huff is kind of the obvious, I can step right into that starting center role. But then you have Diagne, who could be the backup. He could play the 4 potentially. They'd have to evaluate if they think he's kind of has that skill set. But there's a real chance that both Ben Gregg and Graham Ike are playing their final year for Gonzaga. If that's the case, you want to have some depth coming in behind them, and having Huff and having Diagne, who Diagne would then have a year of experience in the system. Huff would obviously have multiple years of experience in the system. That sets you up a little bit better. So that's kind of where I'm at right now with this Diagne situation. If he does commit, we'll have more conversations about it. But this is kind of where we think that this is going, what this means for Gonzaga, what it means for them this upcoming season, what it means for them in the future, and mostly just wanted to be able to say, like, the way that Gonzaga has continued to find new avenues of how to build rosters and how to compete has been one of my most enjoyable things to watch about this program over the last 15, 20 years or so. Well, want to talk a little bit about another player Gonzaga is pursuing to potentially join this roster in the future. That would be another potential U18 star in Nick Kamenia. He is set to play for Team USA's U18 team this summer. We're going to talk about that and Andrew Nembhard potentially playing for Team Canada, all coming up in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we are switching away from talking about potential Gonzaga commit Ismaila Diagne, and we're instead talk about a 2025 target that we've talked about a whole bunch of times here on the Locked On Zags podcast. That's Nick Kamenia, because Nick Kamenia was named to the Team USA U18 team for this summer. Nick Kamenia, who first kind of showed up on the radar for Gonzaga in 2022 when he was on an unofficial visit to Spokane to watch Craziness in the Kennel. At the time, all we really knew about him was that he had played AAU basketball with Gonzaga walk-on Colby Brooks, that he was playing at Harvard Westlake High School, and that he was a not quite top 100 prospect in his class. Once again, Gonzaga's ability to identify talent and pursue players years before they are really on the national radar. This is what has helped build Gonzaga's program. I'll never forget finding out that Duke made an offer to Shemet Karnowski like 18 months after Gonzaga had started talking to him, 18 months after Gonzaga had already offered him, probably 2 years after Gonzaga had started talking to him. And at that time, Karnowski said, I'm going to go to the place that has shown interest in me for multiple years instead of the place that kind of got involved at the last second. That's how Gonzaga wins. And that's the situation here with Nick Kamenia. Now, he has not committed to Gonzaga. And it is very possible that a late swoop in from cough, cough, North Carolina, who just recently made an offer to Nick Camini like a week ago, that he could be swayed and he could leave. That might happen. And that would be frustrating. It would also be an indication that Nick Camini wasn't right to be a Gonzaga Bulldog. If he's willing to not commit to a school that has showed interest in him for 2 years to go somewhere else, you say, oh, that's a bummer. And you tip your hat and you wish him good luck. But it wasn't meant to be. But this is how Gonzaga wins. Is they identify these players early. They get them to understand the family atmosphere. They get them on campus. They express to them, this is what we can do for you. If you're a 6'8" stretch 4 and you want to be an NBA player, look at Corey Kispert. Look at Julian Strother. Look at these guys that we have put in the NBA playing this role for our program. And now Nick Camini is going to be he's going to be on this Team USA team, and he's going to be playing with extremely talented high school players for USA. Jeremiah Fears, commitment to Michigan State. Jasper Johnson, the top-ranked point guard in the 2025 class. Darion Reed, a small forward who's committed to Alabama. Like, there are some really talented players on this team, and Nick Camini, many places I've seen on social media are projecting him to start at the power forward position. He goes from a not top 100 prospect when Gonzaga is getting involved in recruiting him initially to now a starter for Team USA's U18 squad. That is how good Gonzaga is at seeing and recognizing future talent. It is unprecedented, their ability to do this. And again, goes back to, you don't just luck into 25 straight national or NCAA tournament appearances. You do that because you have a knack for finding and identifying talent and pursuing that talent, developing that talent, convincing it to come to your campus. Gonzaga is as good as anybody at that, and this is proof of that. Speaking of the Olympics, Andrew Nembhard is expected, according to his head coach, Rick Carlisle, for the Indiana Pacers, Nembhard is expected to play for Team Canada this summer. And it would have been ridiculous for Team Canada to not do everything they can to pursue him and convince him to join their team after what he just did in the NBA playoffs. I could talk for a very long time about the tremendous growth that we have seen from Andrew Nembhard as a basketball player. He looks like an NBA star, not a good role player, he's a guy who can start on a decent team. He looks like a star. People are starting to compare him to Jalen Brunson. Do you know how great Jalen Brunson has been? The comparison is simple because Andrew Nembhard has played second fiddle in the backcourt to Tyrese Halliburton in Indiana. Jalen Brunson did the same earlier in his career. He ends up in New York where he gets the keys to the kingdom, and he blossoms into an all-NBA player. And now people are saying, Andrew Nembhard's the next Jalen Brunson. I don't know if he's going to get there. That's a really high praise for him. But the fact that that's a conversation happening 2 years after he was kind of unexpectedly the first player selected in the second round of the NBA draft, people were like, that's kind of high for him. We weren't sure if he was even going to get drafted. That was the conversation about him 2 years ago. Now he's being compared to an all-NBA player. It has been a joy to watch Andrew Nembhard thrive in the NBA playoffs. It is unfortunate that the Indiana Pacers were swept in 4 games by the Boston Celtics because the margin of victory in all of those games was razor thin. That did not look like a series that was 4-0 in terms of wins for the Boston Celtics, but that is the reality. That is what happened. Andrew Nembhard had 24 points, 10 assists, and 6 rebounds in the Game 4 loss. In Game 3, he had 32 points and 9 assists. He was insanely efficient. Tyrese Halliburton did not play. He was dealing with injuries, and that's kind of where this Jalen Brunson comparison came along because Nembhard stepped up and was magnificent without Tyrese Halliburton in the mix. In 17 playoff games this year, Andrew Nembhard started every single one of them. He played about 33 minutes per night. He averaged 15 points, 5.5 assists, 3.3 rebounds, and shot a blistering hot 48.3% from three. It was an extraordinary run for Andrew Nembhard. He spoke to the press after the game. One of the things he was asked about was playing for Team Canada. He mentioned he didn't do it last year because he was trying to prepare for his second year in the NBA. He also alluded to that being a selfish decision, which I'm not going to go there necessarily, but if he felt like he was being selfish for not playing for Team Canada, I think it's pretty clear that he is invested in doing so this year. Team Canada should welcome him with open arms. Kevin Pangos was a player who was projected to potentially be in that conversation for a roster spot. Pangos is currently dealing with an injury, unfortunately. And with all due respect in the world to Kevin Pangos, Andrew Nembhard is a better point guard right now to contribute to Team Canada in the Olympics in Paris this summer. So that is a slam dunk. If Nembhard wants it, if Team Canada wants it, this should happen. Nembhard would team up with Team Canada's captain, former Gonzaga Bulldog Kelly Olynyk, who is, of course, now playing for the Toronto Raptors. There have been some other team Canadians who have been in the mix for Canada's national team rosters in the past. I don't think any of the rest of them are going to make it. I don't think Kyle Wilcher is going to make the final roster here. Kevin Pangos, again, dealing with an injury. Brandon Clark technically could play for Team Canada, but he has not really ever shown interest in the past. He's just coming off a major injury. I'd be very surprised if Brandon Clark showed any interest in playing for Team Canada this year. So I think the only Zags you're going to see on that roster this year are Kelly Olynyk and Andrew Nembhard. They won't be the only Zags in the Olympics. Domantas Sabonis will represent Lithuania. There's some potential other options as well. Filip Petrusev could be a representative for Serbia. Joel Ayayi could be a representative for France. I don't know what Rui's status currently is for Japan. Obviously, he represented them last Olympics, but had some mental health issues come out of that, so I don't know what his status is going to be. Frankly, I'm not even sure if Japan qualified for the basketball portion of the Olympics either, but what an accomplishment for Andrew Nembhard. What an accomplishment for Gonzaga basketball. Again, we've kind of one of the themes of this show has been their international recruiting, and to have so many players potentially representing their respective countries as well as Gonzaga at the Olympics this summer. A lot of fun. I meant to mention this earlier. I think Mark Few and the staff are trying to get their whole offseason done well before the Olympics roll around, because Mark Few is going to be coaching with Eric Spoelstra, with Steve Kerr, with Tyronn Lue. He's going to be coaching the Team USA team. And I think he didn't want to be dealing with recruits and want to be dealing with roster spots and all that good stuff later this summer. So he said, let's get a whole roster done before the start of June. And we're just going to call it an off season. I'm going to get to focus on my job over there. And you know what? I don't hate it. I don't hate it at all, especially if the Zags land Diagne here. They will have a full roster. They're going to be in great shape for this upcoming season and beyond. It's going to wrap it up for us today here in the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Like I said, we'll be back on Thursday with a discussing the decision for Michael Ajayi, whether he stays, whether he goes, what it means for the Zags. We're going to wrap up the week on Friday as well, getting you ready for the rest of the offseason, getting you ready for the NBA draft process with Anton Watson, any other updates going on around the program as well. Thanks to all of you for listening, and until next time, as always, go Zags.